folks. This is Kevin Head. Just trying to wait for Brenda to see if she can dial in. Brenda, can you hear us?
Yes, I apologize. I was triple muted on my end, and I will go ahead and start again.
Okay.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Working Group 3 meeting for the Extended Day Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on the greenhouse gas accounting and cost. I am Brenda Corona, representing the ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group, and I'll be providing support for this meeting. For today's agenda, we will have Kevin Head lead us on with introduction, and we will open up 2 questions raised from last meeting from Claire and Mary, and then we will go over the complete working group evaluation and research-specific approach with Kevin, and then do additional workshop that opens up questions on specified zonal approach. And then at the end, Brian Jacobson, who is described for this group, will provide a recap about discussion, and Kevin will go over topics for next meeting. Next meeting that's held this Thursday from 1 to 3. We also have Phil Penningal, who is the coordinator of the EDAM working groups, who is available to respond to questions if needed. And there's meeting reminders for this working group that is intended to be collaborative, as we encourage you to ask questions and share your perspectives on the topics. Please feel free to raise your hand at any time. Kevin will call on you, and your line will be unmuted. Please start by stating your name and affiliation. Today, we plan to use a polling as to this meeting, so feel free to provide your response under the poll that we will provide today. And this meeting is recorded and will be posted the video files on the corresponding working group webpage. If you'd like to see any additional information related to this meeting, feel free to visit the page. The recording and other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. Lastly, if you have any follow-up questions after this meeting, please submit through the inquiry link located on the resource slide at the end of this presentation, and you can reach out to us via email. Now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Kevin Head, who'll go over the meeting objectives.
Thanks, Brenda, and welcome everybody to working group number 3 for the Extended Day Ahead Market. We're in the penultimate week, which is exciting. We've got 2 main objectives for today's discussion. So I'd like to complete that working group evaluation of the resource-specific approach that we started last week. If you'll remember, we had 2 more design objectives that were left to conquer. And so I'd like to close those out. I don't expect that'll take too much longer because I think we've sort of gotten into the flow of it. And then the next piece is I'd like to begin workshopping some of the remaining open questions in the unspecified or zonal approach, and hopefully at least tackle one of those 4 areas. Let me expand a little bit on what I mean by that. So in the March 1st presentation on the unspecified or zonal approach, there were a few potential pathways and design elements that were remained open after that presentation, because we as a working group didn't really have a full discussion and debate and decision on those topics. So what I'd like to do today is try to take those questions, disaggregate them into kind of subtopics, and then try to get the working group to buy off on making decisions on some of those discrete subtopics. And the goal here is to really take that unspecified zonal approach and put it in the best position to be included in the straw proposal. So I'll explain more of how I expect we do that in the latter half once we get through the rest of the resource-specific evaluation. But first, we had a couple of questions that we didn't get to in the last meeting, and those were from Mary Winkie from the Public Generating Pool and Claire from WPTF. And so, I promised that we'd give a chance to give those folks a chance to raise their questions. So Claire and Mary, if you wouldn't mind raising your hands so we can call on you and unmute you. I'll start with Claire. So Claire, can you please go ahead?
Perfect. Thank you, Kevin. This is Claire Bridage from the Western Power Trading Forum. And I suspect Mary and I have kind of similar questions here, but what WPTF raised and what I would like to discuss a little bit today At this point in our process, as WPTF has indicated, we don't have a preference for either approach. We think that both have potential, but similarly, we think that there are a couple of concerns or problems with the approaches as they've been proposed. So, as I said before, we are interested to continue to talk about these and talk about how they can be improved. The point I raised and what I would like some confirmation or some better understanding of how you're going to handle this, we are concerned about taking either one of the proposals off the table before we can fully evaluate them. And the ask we have is that we would like to see CAISO staff do a quantitative testing exercise across all approaches. And I mean, both the two proposals as proposed or as fully better fleshed out today, as well as a variant that Callie will be presenting next week as a resource-specific approach. But what we'd like to see is some quantified results that would let us better assess the effectiveness of the two approaches in doing what we're trying to get them to do. So our thinking is that the CAISO should develop several illustrative load generation scenarios, and then it can use those same scenarios and test them across all the approaches, and then do a comparison that would be provided for stakeholders that would let us see what each approach does for these scenarios, both in terms of LMPs, and that's within the two greenhouse gas zones, as well as LMPs outside the greenhouse gas zones. We'd like to see what each approach results in terms of resources, what the approaches result in, both in terms of the aggregate quantity of transfers into the greenhouse gas zones, as well as the deeming of individual resources to those zones. And then finally, a comparison of emissions. And the pieces that I think we would find useful in terms of emissions are the total emissions across the entire, simulated footprint, as well as the emissions occurring within each greenhouse gas zone and the emissions that are deemed to be transferred into the zone. I'm open, based on feedback from yourself and others at CAISO, as to when this occurs. If you can provide some guarantee or give us some confidence that all these approaches are going forward into the straw proposal, then I think it makes sense to provide more time for the CAISO to do this sort of exercise. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's good. I'd like to ask somebody from the ISO to weigh in on this. As a facilitator, I don't want to get into like what's going to ultimately wind up in the policies and stuff like that. So let me see if anybody has their hand raised. I see that Anya Gilbert has her hand raised. So Anya, do you have any thoughts on this?
Sure, and just as a quick audio check, can folks hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. And thanks, Claire. I think that's a thoughtful question. I think typically the CAISO provides analytics on market outcomes once, an enhancement has been made, or once this would be live, and doesn't develop these type of comparisons. But I think what you're outlining is a really valid recommendation, but I do think it warrants some further discussion from the working group. And I think to that end, it would be helpful to have, a common set of assumptions that we develop together, as well as, to do this analysis or to develop these scenarios or examples. It would help to have sufficient details for all of the proposals. And I know we're getting there, or getting closer this week, talking through some more of the questions around the zonal approach. And I believe Kelly is presenting her alternative to the resource-specific approach next week. So I think once we have more details, we can revisit this question and an approach to kind of compare these different approaches. So I hope that helps, or if there's others from the CAISO that want to chime in there. But I appreciate the question. I think it's a really valid look at, how are we going to compare these approaches, and, what quantitative lens can we put on answering those questions.
Thanks, Anya. Yeah, that's helpful for me to understand. Hopefully that addresses Claire's question. Claire, are you able to, let's see. Okay, not seeing the hand raised, but yeah, thank you, Anya, for that response. And let me give Mary Winky a chance to raise her point from last meeting. Mary?
Thanks, Kevin. I do think I had kind of a question along the same lines as Claire, just trying to understand the process for decision making and how the CAISO will evaluate what it puts in the straw proposal. You know, my observation is that it's with something like the unspecified approach, the zonal approach, which is a more new proposal and building upon and creating something that is new and different than what is currently exists. I think it has been challenging to try to get to a level of detail within the time frame available to really understand you know, how it would work and be able to really adequately compare it to the specified approach. So I guess what I would say is, given that we're kind of coming to the close of the working group meetings, I think it would be unfortunate to, you know, not have some additional time to really flesh out in a straw proposal type phase what the unspecified approach would look like. Because I think it continues to be an approach with a lot of merit, and being able to kind of continue it into the next phase, I think would be helpful. And I also think just in the event it will not be included, I also think it would be helpful to have information from CAISO as to the reason why, or the reason it is considered not implementable, and you know, having more detailed information from a process perspective earlier than later, I think would be good.
Yeah, that's totally fair. and the idea behind the working group is we want to take that unspecified approach, take a look at its viability, as you were saying, and whether it's feasible to implement by 2024, and assess whether there's a lot of stakeholder support for it. And if there is support and viability, I think the ISO's policy team would be ready to include it in the straw proposal. But you know, at this point, I don't think we're quite there yet. But I hope that today's meeting and then Thursday's meeting, where we're going to spend a lot more time with the details of that approach, will be in a much better position to make that judgment. Or when I say we, I mean the ISO policy team. So duly noted, and thanks for raising that point, Mary. All right. Cool. So I'd like to move on. Michelle, if you wouldn't mind giving me presenting rights. Event producer Michelle. Oh, I can share my screen now. Cool. Okay. All right. So thanks, everybody. So this next phase of the conversation today is I'd like to take a look at that resource-specific evaluation that we were doing last week and closing out the last two design objectives. And as a reminder, what we had done early on in the process is develop these design objectives. And you'll see two of them, or three of them on the screen right now. And these are characteristics of a successful greenhouse gas design in the extended day-ahead market. And the idea is now that we have, for the resource-specific approach, a more detailed design proposal of the, you know, how the approach would work, I wanted to take that design approach and match it up against these design objectives to see how well they're met. And what we were doing last week is we first took a look at the design objective and tried to isolate what are the criteria that would help us understand whether or not the design objective was met. And so, you know, what are the metrics that we would need to look at to see if it's met appropriately? And then I wanted to open up, well, we could have a conversation around that. And then after that, we'd open the call up to say, okay, now we have a sense of how we would assess this design objective. So now let's see how well we actually think it is met. And so what I've done is make a 5-point rating, high being, that design objective is perfectly met or almost perfectly met by the resource specific approach. That would be high. And if it was low, that would mean it's barely met or not met at all. And so we'll open the call up for each design objective for folks to give their sort of subjective opinions on that. And then once everyone's had a chance to speak to that point, we will do a poll where we'll open it up to the broader audience to weigh in. And hopefully this encourages people who are a little bit less comfortable or not in a position to weigh in with verbal comments or written comments at this stage to provide some feedback. And that feedback won't be traced to you individually. We won't post individuals' responses up on the screen, but we will get a general sense of where the working group is at. That's the hope, at least. So, we'll start with the design objectives. Just a recap of how I approach this is we'll start with the design objective, see what criteria could be used to assess it, do that assessment, and then open it up to the group with a poll. So I hope we can spend about 20, 25 minutes on this and then move on to that unspecified approach. So let's see. Hopefully you folks are familiar with this. Let me just see if we have any hands raised. Sorry, I gotta go here. Okay. Well, I guess I'll get started. So the sixth design objective is that we should seek simple solutions where possible while balancing precision and implementation feasibility to support state policy objectives. And what I've done here is I've tried to isolate how I would assess this design objective, maybe to just serve as a starting point. So to me, there's words that jump out at me in this. So I started with simplicity and feasibility. I think precision is an important aspect to this design objective, and then supporting state policy objectives. So how I would design this and the criteria that I would use is I would assess it, sort of break it into 3 different components, starting with simplicity and feasibility. So the resource-specific approach, in my mind, is relatively simple, and it's got this proven feasibility because it functions in the Western energy imbalance market today, at least from a technological perspective. And some of the incremental changes, such as changing how the greenhouse gas zone designation works, don't appear to add a significant implementation burden. Moving on to precision, I think we actually captured this in design objective 2 because in my mind, what we're really talking about here is how well does it quantify secondary dispatch? And we've had some of that conversation already. And then third would be how well does it support state policy objectives? And I would think that it does so in, a moderate fashion because it supports the source-specific attribution of greenhouse gas emissions. So let me open the call up to you folks to see if there are any design objective criteria that you would use to assess this design objective. So let me see whose hand is raised. And folks, again, we're just talking about what criteria would be used to assess this design objective. So I see Kathleen has her hand raised. Kathleen?
Great. No, thanks, Kevin. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I think towards the end of the last call, I think I made this suggestion, but I'm repeating it since we're now doing it and actually putting it in the document. So you may recall I mentioned that I believe design for your number 2, I say it's in the same category as your number 2, precision. Design objective number 1, I believe I said also, I also think applies to that precision. And if you scroll back up and remind me what it is, I think it's the inappropriate or inaccurate. Wasn't that design objective number 1?
Oh, we're on design objective number 6 now.
Yeah, but remember how we talked about how that could apply to multiple design objectives? This is another one, that same issues that I raised with the inaccurate baselines.
or
Okay.
inappropriate deemed megawatts, I think goes into that provision for at least us as well.
Okay.
That's all I meant. Sorry. Thank
I
you.
think the inaccurate baseline. So that would fit into precision, do you think? Or is
Yeah,
this
and inappropriate deemed megawatts fit into precision.
inaccurate baseline for? Okay, cool.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any other thoughts on how they would go about assessing this design objective?
Oh, Kevin, can you also add appropriate deemed megawatt in that category too, or are you considering that in secondary as the same thing as secondary dispatch?
I'm not quite following. Can you rephrase your question?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, so back on when we were talking about this, the inaccurate or inappropriate, it's two things. It's is the method accurately setting up a baseline,
Mhm.
and then is the method then appropriately deeming the megawatts? So like those are the two critical things for accuracy and precision.
Okay. Good. How do you spell algorithm here? There's line 2. Algorithm accurately naming things. Okay, cool. Thanks. So does anyone else have any thoughts on this? Or maybe we can just move straight into how well do folks think that this design objective is met by resource-specific approach? And specifically, this is version 2.0 that was presented a few weeks ago by the ISO policy team. So how well do we think that that resource-specific approach seeks simple solutions while balancing precision and implementation feasibility to support state policy objectives? Do folks have any thoughts on this? All right, well, I'm not seeing any hands raised. So I'm going to assume that it's pretty straightforward. And I'll ask Michelle to open up the first poll question to the broader group. And again, folks, please feel free to weigh in on this. We're not going to be using the participant-specific answers in any of this. And all we'll do is just kind of show the distribution of responses. So you've got a couple minutes to respond to this, and encourage you to please submit your answers. So I'll go on mute for a minute or so, and then we'll close that poll down. So thanks. All right, folks, you got about 30 seconds to respond. Don't want to chew up too much of our time sitting in silence here, so if we could cut it at 2 minutes, please, Michelle. So that's about 20 more seconds. And don't forget to click submit after you've selected your answer so it can be submitted. All right, cool. So Michelle, would you pull up the results on the screen if that's okay? Let's take a look. All right. So in this one, we've got 5 saying that it's high, 8 saying that it's medium high, 5 saying that's medium, and 9 each saying it's medium low and low. So if you look at just the average, it looks like it's a little bit more heavily weighted to the medium low category. And 3 folks thought that there wasn't enough information to respond. So thanks everybody for that. And we will move on to the next design objective. And this is our last one for the resource-specific approach. So the resource-specific approach, how well does it meet this design objective, which is that it's a durable market design, including but not limited to allowing for future policy designs and potential linkage. So I couldn't think of any like discrete categories on how to assess this, but I'd welcome other folks' thoughts on this. How would you go about thinking about how to address this one? And if you'd like to, you can also let me know or let the group know how well you actually do think that it meets this design objective. So please raise your hand if you have any thoughts. And I see we have one hand raised, which is Jeff Spires. Jeff, do you want to go ahead? Jeff, cool.
Hi, Kevin. Good afternoon. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I was actually hoping to comment on number 6, if you don't mind. Can I go back and just say something about that one?
Yeah, sure. That's fine.
Yeah, I just wanted to provide a little bit of feedback on that one when we're looking at, you know, a balance of different objectives. I think from my point of view, the simplicity and feasibility of the solution is important, and ultimately any proposal that moves forward has to be feasible. So that's a criteria that needs to be met, but not at the expense of the other two. I think the first and foremost question we need to be asking is whether or not the solution is achieving the intended objectives, both from a market efficiency point of view and in terms of supporting the state policy objectives. And that's why I rated this low, because setting aside the feasibility, having a framework in place that is inaccurately deeming hydro when it's clearly coal and gas being incrementally dispatched is not acceptable and is undermining the state policy objectives. And that's the first and foremost issue at hand. And I think that that's how we need to be evaluating this before we ultimately determine whether or not it's feasible. And I just wanted to provide that feedback.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe we can give Alva a chance. Alva, did you want to weigh in on 6 or 7?
I was going to weigh in on 7, so okay. I can wait until we're finished with Jeff's point. But I did want to.
Yeah, I think we're finished with 6. But thanks for the input from Jeff. Do you want to go ahead and talk about 7, Alva?
Yeah. So the comment would essentially be let's take one possible scenario where some version of GHG pricing were to be rolled out nationally or regionally by fiat in 5 years. What would the transition be between this approach and what would obviously you have to make the same evaluation for the other one? But you could make the claim that the only thing that changes is that you would no longer allow participants to deem, because all energy would be subject to an emissions cost. Mm-hmm. So from that perspective, it seems that if that were the way you would deal with it, it seems like this approach is well suited for that. Not considering the other approach, but just for that. If that's the only change that's required, then it seems like it's a simple transition for that kind of a change. I think if there are a lot of different, essentially, if every state is allowed to have its own, pricing on emissions, which is another possibility, I think this runs into a lot of difficulties because you then have to essentially, as has been pointed out by you and George in looking at this, it's very difficult to start deeming for different areas. And you get into a very combinatorial problem, which I don't think is you can even be assured you're going to get the best solution for certainly with this approach. I would say it's the same with the other one, but I think with this approach, deeming for multiple hour areas is going to be a very heavy lift for making that change in this approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. All right. Then I spelled that wrong, but if subject to different states, let's just call it. Okay. Thanks, Al. That's great feedback. Let me see. The next hand I see up is Mary Winky. Mary, do you want to go ahead and weigh in on this durable market design objective?
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think that the way that I would agree with everything that Alva was just saying, but I also think the other lens through which we've been looking at this is the durability of this type of approach across the implementation of existing clean energy standards across the West, and really looking at some of the accounting implications. And I know we've talked about this a little bit in terms of, sort of the potential for states and policymakers to really start looking to the market operator to be the owner of sort of the designation of resources to loads. And I think that the solution, this solution really doesn't granularly designate resources to loads. It identifies specific resources being imported into, areas with specific loads. I am concerned about the implementation of the types of policies that require individual utilities to purchase particular quantities of clean resources, where you potentially then have states looking for the market operator to say, identify resources that are being allocated to a particular utility inside a particular area. And I think when you start getting to that level of complication, I think the deeming approach becomes sort of unworkable fairly quickly. And I don't think the zonal approach doesn't completely solve this issue either. But when I think about durability, I kind of think of it in the context that Alva was raising, but also in the context of the challenges associated with how many states may begin to look at implementing these types of policies into the future.
Yeah, great point. Let me see if we can. Let me just go back to Alva because he had his hand raised, and then I see somebody else has their hand raised, and I'll call on them afterwards. Alva?
Yeah, this is a response to Mary, and I think it's actually very germane to the whole concept of the EDAM, is the question of what, I think it is really important to get a clear idea of what the strictures will be on actually constraining renewable resources to somehow deliver into a given area, because it's not possible to do electrically, right? I mean, the electrons are going to go where they go. So you're looking for some kind of assurance in real time, which is not really going to exist. The other alternative is that people contract for resources and they're able to count those toward their portfolio. And if that were that implementation, that approach has been used in other situations. If that were the approach, I don't think that Mary's concern would be as great. If there are specific, legal or regulatory requirements phrased in a way that says when you these megawatts have to go to you, there's a question of whether it's even possible to have an integrated market in that setting. And I'd like to see some more explanation of just how stringent those requirements are, because it definitely impacts both the viability of these models, but it also impacts the viability of an EDAM to some extent, if you are going to actually have a legal requirement that says when you produce renewables, they have to go to our loads in real time. It's just, like I said, the physics ultimately aren't going to do that anyway. So the question is to what extent you're actually going to do that. Thank you.
Thanks, Alva. Sorry, George, but let me give Mary a chance to respond back, because I like where this conversation is going. Thanks for being patient. Mary?
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I do think that was some really good points that Alva was making, and I think I agree with the conclusion that if you do have that kind of requirement, you do call into the question the viability of any organized market. And I think that's my concern. The conversation in Washington over the course of the last 2 years with respect to the implementation of CETA has been exactly that conversation, has been exactly the advocates and regulators wanting to have a tool to enable real-time requirement to deliver renewable energy to load. And I think there's an understanding that actual physical delivery of electrons is not a viable approach to regulation. But I think in the absence of a better solution, they're looking for, let's ask the market operator to tell us what's delivered to load in real time. And so my concern, again, sort of back to the durability of this design, is that this deeming approach, I think, leads certain entities and stakeholders to the conclusion that, yes, in fact, the market operator can achieve that and can do that. And at the end of the day, I don't think that's true. And I think that you kind of end up in a space where instead of looking for other solutions to implement policies in a way that is compatible with organized markets, you are instead going in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks. Great discussion there, guys. And I appreciate you putting it in the context of the design objectives. So great job. And I don't think I could capture it accurately on this document, but hopefully folks keep that in mind when they're thinking about their response to this one. So let me call on George Angelides. George?
Yes, thank you, Kevin. This is George Angelides with you. So I just want to respond on this double counting issue. I hear it coming up a lot. I want to clear the air on it. There is no double counting issue, or it can be fully prevented specifically with the resource-specific attribution, because these attributions are calculated by the market. We publish them for scheduling coordinators, and we can also publish them to agencies that they want to police the RES and whatever counting happens at the state level for renewables. And once they have this information about the resource-specific greenhouse gas attribution, then obviously if there is any attempt on double counting, it will be automatically revealed. And actually, states can institute policy and position limits on how much their renewables are allowed to participate in this greenhouse gas model to serve California load or Washington load or whatever the greenhouse gas regulation area be. And it's very simple for the market operator to institute those position limits. They will essentially limit the greenhouse gas bid and the participation of renewables for serving load other than their own state. So that shouldn't be an issue, and it should not be brought up here as a negative specifically to this proposal. That's not a non-issue. The other thing I wanted to reply to Alva is that we have really figured out the algorithm. It's a simple extension of what we have. It's not really a big lift. Alva, we can talk offline. I can show you how we can do it. It's really not a big deal. Thank you.
Thanks, George. And just because we have it at our disposal. This is the summary of the resource-specific approach that's posted on the working group website, which is meant to capture the more granular details of the resource-specific approach. And as we'll see, there's also an existing one of these for the unspecified approach, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But in it, it sounds like the ISO does anticipate doing some of that data sharing with Regis, which would help prevent some of the concerns, at least around double counting, or as George said, it would help reveal that those transactions are being double counted. But just thought that would be a useful data point there. I see Alva and Mary have their hands up, and just in terms of how George, or in the sequence in which George answered their questions, I'll go to Mary first, and then Alva. Mary?
Thanks, Kevin. I just wanted to respond a little bit to George to try to articulate kind of the concern here. And I don't think that the concern is just with double counting, though my observation on the double counting issue is that states are the ones that need to define for themselves, when double counting is occurring. This issue has come up again relative to Washington, because Washington is poised to actually adopt rules, and I believe they're the only state that will have these kinds of rules that specifically state that if energy is reported to or sold to another entity or reported to another program as they're omitting, that the associated rec is not eligible for compliance. And it's not so much an issue of identifying where double counting is occurring, or even being able to flag eligible megawatt hours available for deeming. I think the challenge is that as you get to, again, 80%, very high, 100% even clean energy requirements, I think what you'll find is that entities, in order to need to plan for compliance, they're not going to have any energy available. And I think the question that I have, and I don't necessarily know the answer to this, is that in the absence of being able to decide, and control kind of the amount beforehand that will be deemed, I think you challenge the utilities planning for compliance. And I think that what needs to be considered is what the decisions get made at that point. And I question kind of the long-term, again, we're talking about long-term durability, the long-term durability of a solution that doesn't allow entities to be able to make that direction. And I think what utilities end up doing is, not participating fully in the market in a way that would enable the achievement of the benefits of the market. So I welcome kind of further discussion on this issue, but I don't think it's quite as simple as was portrayed.
Okay. Yeah, and point taken. And let me move on to Alva, and then just for the sake of time, I want to close down the conversation here so we can get to the unspecified approach part of this working group. So let me have Alva weigh in, and then we can take a shot at addressing this one. So Alva.
Thanks, Kevin. This is Alva Svoboda, PG&E. So I'm never going to question George's statements about what is algorithmically possible. I do think he is. I was talking about a world in which there are multiple GHG areas, and you're deeming to send your willingness to supply each of them in different ways. And I think even if it's algorithmically feasible, and I do want to have that discussion with George, I think it becomes a very difficult question for the utilities, sort of along the lines of what Mary was saying, as to how you would even represent your data for a given day's market run. I think the other issue that I see that Mary has brought up, which I think in a sense means we're already in a world of multiple GHG zones, and I think this is going to be a problem for both approaches, is you can sort of conceptually say you're going to deem that your renewables don't go to other areas. but that requires that you define every BAA as a zone, or every regulatory area has to be its own zone. You can't have two GHG zones and one big non-GHG zone. At that point, you have to have multiple effectively GHG zones, because you're keeping the renewables in as well as letting emitting resources out. And so you've already got a model in which you have to encompass these multiple zones. So I would at least say that George's next formulation has to include that if he wants to claim that it's feasible. You can't just say we're going to start with California and Washington and everybody else is outside of it, because now we're already in a world where we know people may need to keep their renewables in as well as let emitting resources out. So I think that I'd like to see that in the next formulation drawn out a little bit more clearly.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. And a few points that I don't know if they were captured or not in the conversation, but I would say that the resource-specific approach does allow for future potential linkages of greenhouse gas zones, sort of classically construed, meaning like zones with carbon pricing. And it also allows for new greenhouse gas zones and changes to existing greenhouse policies. Like, for example, if Washington decides to move to a resource-specific attribution for their imports, right now they're just proposing to use an unspecified rate for imports settled through the Western Energy Imbalance Market. So just a few feasibility and durability points that I wanted to raise, at least the way that I thought of it. So I see there's a bunch of hands up, guys, and I appreciate that. But I do want to make sure that we don't spend all of our time trying to rehash some of these arguments. So I'd like to give folks a chance to weigh in through the polling mechanism. So I'm going to ask Michelle to go ahead and open up that the poll on this one, so everyone can weigh in, and if there's time for more conversation afterwards, I encourage us to do that. So, yep, thanks, Michelle. And just a reminder, folks, to select your answer and click submit, and we'll have about a minute to respond to this one, so a little bit of less time than the previous one. All right, folks, the poll is up, and maybe we can show the results of the poll, Michelle, just to see where everyone's standing on this one. All right, so the question of whether the design objective 7, which is durable market design, including but not limited to allowing for future policy designs and potential linkage. We had 6 folks say that it was highly met, 5 say that it was medium high met, 4 say it was medium, 4 said medium low, and then 9 said low. So, and 4 said there wasn't enough information to answer. So another one that's kind of in this medium low to medium range of how well the design objective is met. So I did see that I may have misconstrued something about Washington's policy for imports. Mary, would you mind correcting me where I made a mistake?
Sure, Kevin, thanks. And I just wanted to clarify that I understood what you said. I think you said that right now EIM imports for Washington are considered unspecified.
Yes, that's
Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I just wanted to clarify that Washington does have a requirement to do a rulemaking between now and 2026 to address imports from organized markets. So I would expect that they would want to adopt rules similar to California's approach to imports from the EIM. At least that's what we are anticipating.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't want to characterize that future rulemaking. I just, but point well taken.
Yeah.
And thanks, Mary, for that clarification. All right, folks. Well, so I think we've had a lot of good conversations about the resource-specific approach. And thank you for everybody who weighed in. And sorry to cut it a little bit short. Depending on how these next few meetings go, I expect we probably have time to come back to this topic. But I really would like to take a pivot here to talk about the unspecified or zonal approach. And what I'd like to do is I'll kick off how I think we should proceed from here, and then let folks hop in to see if they agree with how I'm thinking about this topic. And then if they do, we'll proceed from there. So first, what I'd like to do is, in the March 1st presentation that was given by Mary Winke from Public Generating Pool and Jeff Spires from PowerX, they gave a framework for the unspecified approach. And they did highlight a few areas where there's several different potential pathways. And what I'd like to do is try to get the working group to start chewing over which pathway we should take, and make decisions on certain kind of sub-elements of the unspecified or zonal approach. And specifically, the four areas that I saw that jumped out at me were the source-specific pathway, which is the way that certain resources, if they don't want to have to exceed the hurdle rate in order to serve the greenhouse gas zone, would use this source-specific pathway and be able to serve the greenhouse gas zone directly. So that was one. Second was the definition of the hurdle rate, so what the hurdle rate is and how it's calculated. Third would be compliance and reporting, so what entity bears the compliance obligation and what information do they report. And then fourth would be the settlement of that GHG hurdle revenue. So what I propose to do is take the rest of today's meeting and all of Thursday's meeting to try to address some of those open questions that are still out there. And the goal here, as I said earlier, is to best situate this unspecified or zonal approach to be as detailed as possible going into the straw proposal. And the idea here is to take the responsibility away from the folks who originally proposed it and share it with the rest of us in the working group, because we all have a stake in making sure that this approach is as fleshed out as possible. And we all have ideas about how it should look. So I'd like to make sure that that decision-making authority is shared with the working group. First, though, what I'd like to do is highlight this document, which I'm showing on my screen now, which should look familiar to you folks, at least design-wise. This is our revised scope document. And what Mary and Jeff did was fill it out for the unspecified or zonal approach. A lot of work went into this, so I really want to make sure that we thank Mary and Jeff for doing this. I appreciate that. And the purpose of this document, similar to the one that we have posted for the resource-specific approach, is really to be a reference that we can come back to as we start to think through not only those four open areas that I was discussing, but also when we're ready to do the evaluation, similar to the one that we just did for the resource-specific approach. So what I propose to do, and I want to open up the call here to the broader group, though, is are we okay with proceeding with that sort of assumption that we're going to be sharing the responsibility of fleshing out this proposal as a working group? And it's a relatively substantial time commitment, so I want to make sure that everyone's on board with spending about 3 hours of the working group trying to flesh out some of these details. And I'll show you what it looks like in terms of this document. So I've gone through and I've disaggregated each of these topics into sort of sub questions. And what I'd like to do is get everybody to join in on coming up with an answer to these questions and making decisions where decisions are needed so that we can really have a fleshed out, spelled out proposal. So the question I have for the group is, does anyone disagree with that approach or have any potential different ways to tackle the issue? So go ahead and raise your hand. I see Stuart has had his hand raised very patiently, so I'll call on Stuart first. Stuart?
Hey, Kevin, thank you. I just want to go back, not comment on this specific aspect of the discussion, but I want to go back and talk about the longevity real quickly of George's proposed solution. I appreciate the eloquence of George's solution. I do not think it is tenable longer term. There is going to need to be a further iteration of that. I think it's important that that's recognized in the straw proposal, and happy to provide comments at that point on that, because it needs to evolve at some point. And then there's another component I'm still not clear on. George mentioned the use of shift factors or whatever. We don't need to get into it here, but obviously be looking for how the shift factors would be applied in George's solution. But more importantly, I think Alva is hitting on an important points. Mary's hitting on important points. And we've similarly raised concerns long term about some potential solutions that may be difficult for non-GHG zones, we recognise, but ultimately, as we close the gap on CES and cap and trade and LA's particular, from LA's standpoint, we're going to get forced to self-schedule a lot, which really precludes what we can make available for optimization, which really becomes a concern. So we need to recognise that in the straw proposal, that things need to continue to evolve if the current kind of status quo that's being offered is what we're going to decide upon.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. And that was Stuart from Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Thanks, Stuart. So let me just refocus attention back to the unspecified zonal approach here to see if folks are on board with trying to tackle these 4 questions in the next working group and a half here. So I see Kathleen has her hand up. Kathleen, do you have any thoughts on how we proceed in this area?
I actually assumed you were just going to start going through your list, and I raised my hand to talk on substance. So if others want to take a different approach, I'm fine with that. I'll turn it back over to the group.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Let me just make sure that there's no folks who have significant concerns with a deep dive into the unspecified approach. I don't think that there will be. I just didn't want the question to go unasked. So I saw Alva had his hand raised. Alva, do you want to hop in on this topic, or did you have something else?
Yeah, on this one, you might have, I didn't quite get the division of topics, but I think one topic that will help make this unspecified approach a lot more firmed up as a proposal is what is the proposal for going to real time. So I just think that's, it's sort of answered for itself in the resource specific approach because you simply adopted the real time approach. Mm-hmm. I think that needs to be answered as part of this if you want the proposal to really hold together. So I don't have an answer on it, but I just think that should be part of it as well.
Yeah, sure. Let me just confirm. So this is the document that has the details as they are now for the unspecified or zonal approach. And this is our scope document that we kind of agreed, hey, this is the total scope of the conversation. And all the way at the bottom, sorry for scrolling through all this, look away if you get dizzy. But in this, I think the proposal as of when this document was posted, which was yesterday or this morning, was the intent is to align the day ahead and real-time approaches. So, the idea here is that this would not only be adopted for an extended day ahead market, but also for the WEIN's real-time market. Does that answer your question, Alpha, or is your...
It answers that it's in the scope. I'm hoping there'll be some conversation about how exactly that's supposed to be done. But yes, that answers it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, let's make sure that we have a chance to talk about that. So thanks. Let's see, the next hand that I saw up was Claire, and then I'll go to George. Claire?
Kevin. First, I want to support your proposed approach, but one idea that might facilitate when we walk through this is to clearly parse out where the differences are between the two approaches. And when I did a first scan of your document, for instance, the whole first section of the path specific or the resource specific path into the greenhouse gas zone, that to me is something that would be almost identical between a resource specific approach and a zonal approach, at least the way WPTF is thinking about it. Where I think there are clear differences is what happens beyond that. How are other transfers that are not, for instance, contracted to load within the greenhouse gas zone treated? So I think it would be very useful when you walk through here to think about which of these elements would essentially be common, whether it's a resource-specific approach or a zonal approach, and which would clearly be different.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. If I miss any, let me know. Feel free to raise your hand, and I'll try to call those out. So thanks, Claire. Good input. And I see George and Glees. George, do you want to weigh in on how we're thinking about tackling this unspecified or zonal approach?
Kevin, I just want to clarify something that was said earlier, make sure that we don't have the wrong understanding here. There are no shift factors used in either approaches. Anything that is related to the greenhouse gas model, however you want to implement it, none of the proposals is using shift factors right now, and I never said so there's probably a misunderstanding. I think Stuart mentioned something like that. So yeah, we don't use shift factors, okay? It's nothing about physical flow here, specifically for injections on the grid. There is a correlation with physical flow when we calculate what is imported into a greenhouse gas region, which we can calculate as a difference between generation and load schedule in that region, and then we turn around and allocate this one way or another, but not using shift factors.
Yep,
and
thanks,
the other comment that's I think I heard from Stuart is that there is something that we need to do to expand or elaborate on the methodology, but I don't know what it is. If there are specifics, I would welcome them to consider them, but at this point I draw a blank. I don't know what is it that we have to build on this model other than what we already said that we have as enhancements planned for it. So if there is something specific, please, I'd like to know. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe you and Stuart can take that conversation offline, and we can maybe raise the details of it to this working group if and when that conversation happens. So thanks, guys. The next hand that I saw up was from Doug Howe. Doug, what do you think? Is this a good way to tackle fleshing out the unspecified or zonal approach? Go ahead.
This is Doug Howe with the PUC MOU group. We do think that both approaches deserve careful consideration. So I would certainly support trying to flesh out this proposal, the zonal proposal, a lot more. It has some attractive features to it. However, the reason I raised my hand, Kevin, is because a question did come up with the commissions that I'm representing that we don't know if the zonal approach can answer it. So I want to make sure that the question gets seated somewhere in your 4 categories. And the issue is this. Typically, the burden of acquiring allowances is in a cap and trade program is put on the resource, and it's up to the resource to acquire enough allowances under the cap to meet their needs and requirements to import energy into the GHG zone, wherever that is. Without attribution to specific resources, we're a bit confused on how allowances, the correct number of allowances would be allocated and to whom they'd be allocated. Would there, for example, have to be a reserve from the auction that is reserved for importations, and how would they know how many allowances to put into that reserve, or is there some easier way for this to be managed? So that's a question that we have about how this would all work, and we would like to see it somewhere.
Okay, yeah. First, thanks for supporting how we're going to proceed on this. Let me see. So this proposal, I know that it's in here somewhere. Sorry, folks. Just trying to find. Okay. So the idea behind who would bear that responsibility in the unspecified approach, and this is just from this document. So there's two pathways, right? So there's the source-specific treatment. So those folks would be responsible for making the reporting and would have to procure the allowances if they're going to use this source-specific pathway, which is different than the resources that clear the hurdle rate. For those ones that, for that energy that serves the greenhouse gas zone by clearing the hurdle rate, their proposal is that the ISO would be responsible for providing that data on unspecified imports from the non-greenhouse gas zone to the greenhouse gas zone to the relevant state authorities. And
if I can, the question concerns the latter one. Well, first of all, it wasn't clear to us that the resource-specific path included emitting resources, so that's something that we would want to be clear on. But the second path has us concerned that determining how much emitting resources go through that path may exceed the available cap if this is all determined on an after-the-fact basis. So it's kind of a chicken and egg question. How do you know how much to allow through that second pathway if you've got a cap on the allowances?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great, how do you know? Okay, but let me just to answer the question about how the hurdle rate revenue would be distributed, which would ultimately result in the procurement and retirement of allowances. Here they're saying that the hurdle rate revenue will be redistributed to load-serving entities, who will then be responsible for reporting the emissions, purchasing and retiring allowances, and just the data would be obtained from the ISO. So that's what the zonal or unspecified approach attempts to handle this. In terms of would the cap actually be enforced, like how would the imports be enforced, is difficult to tell. So I understand that question. It's a good one. So let me just see if anybody else has any more specific questions about how we propose to tackle this. I don't want to start getting into the nitty-gritty of how compliance and reporting will be handled, because you'll see here that's the third item on the list, and I want to make sure that we tackle them in order, because the logical order of this is that we have to start with, I don't know, I just want to make sure it's followed logically and not start at the end, which is the compliance and reporting piece, though I think that's a crucial one and one we'll have to tackle. So with that in mind, Jeff or Mary, I see both of your hands were raised. Do you have concerns with how we're going to proceed with filling in some of the open questions, at least that were open in my mind, in the unspecified or zonal approach? Let me maybe give Jeff a chance to hop in here. Jeff, what do you think?
Thanks, Kevin. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I'd raised my hand to help answer some of Doug's question. It sounds like maybe you'd like to defer that.
Yeah, let's hold until we get to that conversation because it is.
Okay. I think that, talking through some of these other elements are certainly worth the time. I think that, probably my high level feedback, particularly with respect to number one, is that really fundamentally, when we're thinking about what we're trying to accomplish, we're trying to formulate a market design that meets the program requirements that are associated with various jurisdictions applying GHG pricing. And so I think what we're going to find, just having scanned through some of the detailed questions you've asked, that some of those are actually better answered by the environmental program requirements themselves, and that what we need to be doing is asking ourselves whether we can find a framework through the market to facilitate meeting those requirements. So I think it's worth walking through them all, and I think that having a grasp of, how does the hurdle rate get defined and how could that be done efficiently, and how do the dollars get collected and flow is all really important. But I think ultimately some of the details on meeting certain requirements to get access to the zone are really better left for the environmental programs themselves.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Jeff. Let me go to Mary. Do you have any thoughts in general of how we're proceeding on the unspecified approach here, or did you want to talk about the compliance or reporting aspects? And the latter.
I did have a follow-up question for Doug on his question, but I can hold that if that's your preference. But then I will also echo just a little bit what Jeff said in particular on this first item. I do think it's important to consider sort of how, if there are criteria that are applied to the sort of specific pathway, sort of who's responsible for those criteria. And I think that to the extent that we can really draw from existing criteria and existing regulatory requirements to inform that conversation, I think is a good thing for us to consider as a group.
I agree. Okay, thanks, Mary. I see Kevin Best has his hand raised. Kevin, would you go ahead and introduce yourself and let us know your thoughts here, and then I'd like to get started on this.
Yeah, sure. Can you hear me, Kevin?
I can, yeah.
Yeah, Kevin Best, Real Energy in Napa. So unfortunately, this is way above my pay grade. This is not what I do every day, but I just wanted to throw out that the commissioner, he wants to know exactly what resources are going where. And our fuel programs at CARB are, operating on approved pathways, but the variable in the different pathways to getting electricity are all known, and they're known in advance of the trade. So CARB prints grams of CO2 per megajoule on our grid. This doesn't have to do with Washington, but we know by the hour what our grams per CO2 per megajoule are in any given hour. So we can choose to purchase or not purchase, and that's just a flat grid purchase. Now, if we're doing a curtailed purchase, then we go right back to the resource, and we can see it's a zero or near zero carbon content electricity for our fuels. So I guess I would what this is implying is, do we try to lay on our neighbors, the task of coming up with an hourly greenhouse gas content like CARB does every January?
Okay.
I'm not even sure that's in context. I'll let you have that, Kevin.
Okay. Are you referring to the low carbon fuel standard or the
Yes.
green?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The LCFS. I mean, all these decisions have to be made in advance. We can't be surprised about the trade we made, and we have to know exactly where it came from and what the carbon content is. And it's easy to assume all curtailed power is zero carbon, but that's not actually going to be true.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I don't know a lot about the LCSF. Can't even tell you the acronym other than, I said the acronym wrong, but the low carbon fuel standard. So I can't really respond back to your point here. We're more focusing on the cap and trade program. So thanks for the input here.
Sure.
Okay, so folks, I'm going to get started on these decision points. And what I'm going to start with is the slides that were given on March 1st, just to put this into context. So you'll remember that we have a greenhouse gas zone and a non-greenhouse gas zone, and that they proposed, or the unspecified approach proposes to, one way to serve the greenhouse gas zone is if the price differential between the non-greenhouse gas zone and the greenhouse gas zone is sufficiently high enough and it overcomes that, or low enough rather, it overcomes the hurdle rate, then the non-greenhouse gas zone can serve the greenhouse gas zone. Alternatively, you could utilize a source-specific pathway to serve the greenhouse gas zone directly. And there were two paths that were proposed here. One is this longer term one, which defines the greenhouse gas zone's boundaries to treat the resources which might be physically located outside of the greenhouse gas zone as if they're physically located within the greenhouse gas zone. And so this is a longer term commitment to meet the load within the greenhouse gas zone. Alternatively, there's a second path, which is a shorter term one, which is conceptually similar to specified source imports in bilateral markets, and might be applicable to surplus non-emitting supply like solar oversupply. Or there might be a combination of these two that might ultimately wind up in the unspecified or zonal approach. So when I started to think through, okay, what does this path one look like? I broke the question down into, okay, how do you become eligible for this criteria? And it seems that for this pathway, and it seems that a contractual commitment is a core component of that that ability to be considered in the greenhouse gas zone. So the question came to mind is what types of contracts are acceptable? I mean, I don't really have a good sense of what types of contracts exist out there to link generation and load. I know that there's one type which we call a pseudo-tie arrangement, which has a very technical term in the context of CAISO's market, but might be more simplified just to say that it's a resource that's physically outside of the load serving entity's zone, the BAA, but is contractually committed to serve that zone. So what I wanted to do is open this first question up and say, okay, what types of contracts are we really talking about here? And then a secondary question would be, do they need to be backed by transmission? Like, does there need to be at least a contractual pathway for that energy from the generating resource to serve the load within the greenhouse gas zone? So let me open that up to the audience to see what you guys think. What types of contracts are we talking about here? And does it need to be backed by transmission? So Kathleen, you had your hand up and you've been waiting patiently. So go ahead.
No, thanks, Kevin. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I do have a direct response, but I also have kind of like a general framework. So if it works for you and is okay with you, and it's not long, can I paint the picture that I walked away with after the last presentation and tee up the answer that's in there to this?
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah, so I thought, and thanks for going over that again. So I thought the conversation was very productive when Mary and Jeff went through and we folks asked questions, took a step back, thought about it. I have an idea for how we might be able to address it, and I'm curious for some feedback from them and of course from the CAISO to see if it makes, it seems like we should pull in any of these threads. My idea is rooted in what Jeff and Mary were just saying about how I think we need to be comfortable with acknowledging which items are going to be the state environmental regulatory responsibility versus the CAISO. So I'm focusing more on the mechanics. If we were to go forward with this zonal approach, I think a way to support source-specific participation outside of a hurdle, it would be to actually, I think we can leverage the greenhouse gas bid megawatt. So we have existing bid functionality of that. You may need to add, if there are additional greenhouse gas zones, you may need to add another greenhouse gas bid megawatt. So we'd have one for California, let's say one for California, one for Washington, but redefine them as not representing you're willing to be deemed, but as representing that you have been contracted as a source specified resource for that program. One way to kind of respect that delineation between the state and the CAISO's roles and responsibility here, I think is the CAISO could introduce tariff requirements that greenhouse gas bid megawatt is what it means. The entities can submit those bids if they comply with state environmental regulatory requirements. That's kind of similar to how we treat a lot of local reliability authority stuff, especially in the EIM. We've done that for like demand response issues. We said consistent with that area's rules. So tariff requirements, you have to fulfill the state environmental regulatory requirements, which if they require transmission, that's already incorporated in that tariff language. If they require long-term contracts, that's incorporated in that tariff language. If they don't, that's implicitly incorporated. There's some elegance to that. The other thing that I do think we'd want to do is require that the greenhouse gas bid adder price that's submitted along with those bids is reflective of the resource-specific emission rate rather than a willingness to sell. It should represent that resource's emission rate along its operating range. That's just to address some of the market power or the inaccurate information, some displacement that may not be as precise by ensuring that the tariff requires it to be an emission rate and not able to be submit bids below your actual emission rate. That also better support state policies. So I hope that helps answer at least two of your questions here. The other thing I want to make
restate.
Sure. Yeah, you have a question? Yeah.
So the idea is the mechanism by which folks could say, hey, the way that they can indicate that they have a contractual commitment to serve load inside the greenhouse gas zone could be done by the existing greenhouse gas bid element, which so the existing greenhouse gas bid adder has two components. It's got the megawatts and then the price. So the megawatts would say, hey, I'm contractually committed to serve the greenhouse gas zone for this many megawatts. And then the price would be required to be based on the emissions intensity of the resources output. And in submitting that bid, you would effectively be verifying that you have a contractual commitment to serve the load within the greenhouse gas zone. And so that could either be the path one, which would be defining it, but it seems like more to me that it would be the path two, which is the, let me go back to the PowerPoint. It seems like it would be more like a path two approach where they're making the election with more frequency, but it does seem that it could use path one as well. Am I thinking about that correctly?
You are, and I thought about it the same way. I think it's a hybrid of both. I think that, like, you could either, you're effectively doing path 1 or path 2 to some extent by leaving it up to the state rules of what they allow or don't allow. If the CAISO wanted to take path 1 a little bit more firmly, you could still have a master file registration, and then greenhouse gas bid validation rules only allow to be submitted if it's in that master file. So I open that up, of course, open it up with a group. I take the same read. It's just putting forward a mechanics approach that I think either of these can be done, or a hybrid. But I personally think allowing it to be left up to a tariff requirement, kind of along the lines of things we've done in the past, and then up to state regulation makes the most sense. Because the elegance of this is that the state would then, after the fact, they're already going to continue to audit the transactions to ensure that entities under these compliance obligations have complied with it. If they identify any bids that were submitted that did not meet their requirements, that would be addressed after the fact. And with the tariff requirement, the states would know that they could then refer that back to the CAISO and let the CAISO know that the tariff violation had occurred. You could even make it really, rather than kind of a more difficult violation, some of the things the CAISO does to disincentivize things like that is like $500 per incident penalties that are in the BPM, you know?
Okay, yeah, I think we're getting a
like
little...
There's lots of things you can do.
Yeah, let me...
there's one more functionality thing, Kevin, just to be clear on. The hurdle does not apply to these.
Correct.
I just want to be clear about that. That's how they get around the hurdle. Thank you.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Let me turn it over to Jeff just to gauge his reactions on the mechanism there. And I think really the core idea is that instead of having to have tariff-defined contractual commitments of how long they need to be and the frequency and stuff like that, the type, we put the burden on the scheduling coordinator to say, by submitting this megawatt component, I'm confirming that I have something that would meet this criteria. So Jeff, what do you think?
Thanks, Kevin. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I'll give you some thoughts from PowerX's perspective. I think we have some common ground with what Kathleen was getting at least from a fundamental perspective around kind of what the market should be trying to do in terms of enabling these types of transactions. But we have some additional thoughts and maybe a slightly different way of thinking about this. So the first thing I'll say is, on the screen here, you've identified some detailed questions really to do with what types of contracts would be necessary to enable resource-specific treatment under a certain GHG jurisdiction, and is transmission required for that purpose? And I think that the high-level answer I would give is that really depends on what the relevant program is requiring.
Mm-hmm.
If a state program requires demonstration of delivery for imports into their state, then from our point of view, the resource should be reserving transmission and delivering that. We shouldn't be designing a market that just claims that that delivery has occurred when there hasn't been a demonstration, and we know that there are challenges there. Mm-hmm. And so to that end, one simple solution that we think helps address this issue is to enable entities to pre-submit effectively base schedules ahead of the market. That would allow them to submit an E-tag that shows that they are taking their resource and delivering it to a specific jurisdiction. And that's really useful in a number of ways that address a lot of the issues we're talking about. First of all, if a program requires demonstration of delivery, that gives you the mechanism to do that. You can use the E-tag and clearly demonstrate that resource was delivered and scheduled to a specific jurisdiction. Secondly, it allows the participant themselves to determine how its resource is being used, which is something that Mary and others have raised, including earlier today. And that actually, I think, addresses a number of issues because, for one, by supporting something like that, it allows delivery of all of a resource or potentially only a part of a resource. It allows delivery of a specific resource in some hours and not others, to the extent that it's, not necessarily able or willing to be delivered in all hours. It could have the flexibility to decide. And it would be making the determination of which jurisdiction it's choosing to deliver to the extent that there are multiple GHG zones. So in our mind, that is a very simple solution that's a enabling feature that would support meeting the program requirements. It would be very similar with and consistent with the existing CARB requirements, but it would also be durable, because as other programs are developed, the specific requirements could be tailored to meet whatever those future programs are asking for. And the last thing I'll just say is that when I say, pre-submitting a base schedule, I don't mean a self-schedule. I just mean being able upfront to show that you intended your resource to be delivered across jurisdictions to some other location, and you have an E-tag that you can point back to for that purpose. But the expectation would be that then when you run the day-ahead and real-time markets, you could re-optimize that and still ensure you're getting the benefits of the market. So that is, for example, a solution that we think would be logical, that would fit into the zonal approach well, and would provide that mechanism and that framework for enabling resource-specific access, but still ensure that ultimately it's the program requirements that determine, how that, what needs to be met from a contractual or other point of view to make sure that they qualify that way.
Okay, sure. Let me see if I can restate what you said to see if I understood. So the idea here is, first is that instead of, kind of similar to what Kathleen was saying, instead of us being the policy maker and for CAISO market policy, instead of them describing in detail what the types of contractual commitments are here, we leverage the requirements of the individual states that have perhaps criteria about it being backed by transmission or the length of the contract, et cetera. And then the way that information would be conveyed to the market is you would submit some sort of pre-market base schedule type thing that wouldn't set the actual what the market will end up optimizing. It won't predetermine the market results, but rather it'll just indicate that the scheduling coordinator in question intends that the resource serve load within the greenhouse gas zone. And then the market would take that information along with the other characteristics that were submitted in the bid and optimize it in the day-ahead and real-time markets. Is that right?
Yes, and I think that's a pretty good recap, and I think that framework works particularly well in meeting program requirements where the expectation is that external resources that are being imported to the zone are demonstrating their delivery.
Sure. Okay. Let me see if anybody else has any concerns with how that approach might work. Alva has had his hand up for a while, so maybe Alva can hop in and let us know.
Yeah, Elvis Svoboda, PG. I would have a concern with this. The final point that was made by Jeff about the idea of a sort of something that's not a self-schedule but has characteristics of a self-schedule for, I think that is a little bit of an unlikely construct. I think you basically do have to self-schedule if you're going to tag in the way that was suggested. But I think by and large, the conversation that and the descriptions that Kathleen and Jeff gave were very useful, not only for this approach, but because you cleverly initiated this description with something that's essentially in common between the two approaches. This is the resource-specific part of the non-resource-specific approach. I think a lot of these comments are usable in thinking about how to do these same things in the resource-specific approach. I just wanted to note that this is a very useful information, not just for this description, but in general, for how to handle regulatory requirements potentially.
Yeah, thanks. And so just thinking about the pre-submission of something backed by an e-tag, the day-ahead market horizon, the bids have to be submitted by 10 a.m. Pacific, but I don't think tags are available by that point. So do you think we could have this tag requirement up front, or would it need to be maybe an after?
That's a problem. Another problem with that, I think, and I think that would be another thing. I think there are ways of sort of verifying that you've provided a self-schedule, and the ISO could provide ways of identifying that this kind of intent to, because it's just another flavor of deeming, isn't it? You're essentially saying, I'm going to allow you to say that this self-schedule is intended for use in this by this other entity or by this entity. So I think as long as you're in the kind of the framework of within the market, it can be done. As soon as you start to require other these additional requirements might be actually quite onerous, especially in the case that Jeff was suggesting, where you're not even planning on necessarily scheduling to that. I think a tag actually requires transmission. At least that was my understanding, and you might even be paying something for it. So I hope I'm not just displaying my ignorance here, but I think that the requirements of putting in a tag at any rate, even if they don't involve that, are going to have some transaction costs that are additional to just your vanilla participation in the market. So, but I really like the direction in a way that Kathleen is pointing to, is that there's no need to put artificial constraints on how resource-specific pathways are defined in here, because they're not. There's no constraints on them in the resource-specific approach. So whatever you can do in the software there, you can do in the software here, and so there's no reason to constrain within the algorithm, as it were, and the data that's going into the market. You can have constraints. You can have additional data that's built up around these schedules, but it doesn't have to impact the execution of the market.
Okay. All right. So maybe let's just refocus, put the indication issue to the side really quick, and just focus on the nature of the contractual commitment that would be required to be in this. That would basically tie you into the greenhouse gas zone. So I think this one was a red herring here. I think we're converging on a solution that defines the contractual commitment as something that's defined by the relevant environmental or state requirements for a contract that's set up to serve load in a different area. So let's just stick on that and pull that thread a little bit further. I see a couple of hands have been raised. Mary has had her hand raised for a while, so I'd like to call on Mary Winky.
Thanks, Kevin. I was just gonna echo that I like the way that Kathleen kind of set this out in terms of, and I think enables the flexibility in the solution to kind of put together a skeleton or a framework that can accommodate different types of policies depending upon what criteria they want to apply. Again, for enabling that any resource over either pathway to serve load inside the GHG zone on a specific basis. So I just wanted to give an endorsement on going in this direction.
Okay. Thanks, Mary. Doug? Doug, do you want to weigh in?
there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think we would definitely endorse the approach of defined by state requirements. That makes a lot of sense. I think it solves some issues there. But I would just point out that I think you would probably want to use this path for rate-based resources of a utility in a state in a GHG zone, where that rate-based resource is located out of the state. This would seem to be the ideal method by which they would want an allocation of that resource to end up in the state, unless I misunderstand something completely.
I'll let others weigh in on that. I'm not sure I understand exactly the question, but if others have thoughts on that, feel free to raise your hand. Let's call on Vijay first, and then Kathleen, and then we're almost out of time, so just we'll probably have to wrap it up in about 5 to 7 minutes. So Vijay, go ahead.
Thank you. I'll be very frankly honest in saying, Vijay with WRA, we need to appreciate both proposals, and I've been listening today to all of this. I have a question for Mary and Jeff. How much are the EIM entities on board with this proposal? And is there a preference between the two options, the approach-specific option and in terms of the scenarios? I just want to better appreciate where are the EIM entities on this whole initiative, or it's just more of a valuable brain trust contribution from the two of you. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. I don't want to get into folks picking sides at this point. I really want to focus.
I was not taking sides. I think I was just, Kevin, I think I have a reason to ask this, if you don't mind, because I think 2 years ago this proposal had started, and I think EIM entities had raised ideas. The overall approach with the EDAM is EIM entities have shared a lot of brain trust and ideas. So I just wanted to better appreciate, is this a coalition of a few, a coalition of a larger willing, or there'll be more debate and thinking? I'm just trying to appreciate the diversity of thought within the EIM entities community. That's all I'm trying to do.
Okay. All right. Kathleen, do you want to weigh in? And then if not, I'm going to, I think we're converging on this being the solution. And just considering the number of decisions we have to make, I'd like to put a stamp on this to say that we would define the contractual commitment based on the state requirements. So Kathleen?
Thanks, Kevin. I'll be incredibly brief. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. I wanted to endorse Jeff's suggestion to consider an ETAG submission prior to the day ahead. I think that jives with what my view of making sure that the state regulatory agencies have all the information they need. So if they have that requirement, folks can submit the ETAGs by that time. They'd have the timestamps. They'd be able to validate it after the fact. So I think there's a lot of value there. So I wanted to endorse Jeff's suggestion.
Thanks. So the timing, though, is in the real-time market, because 3 o'clock, if I understand correctly, is when the ETAGs are due. So
yeah, and I'm endorsing the idea of adding an ETAG submission deadline, let's say at 8 a.m.
Well, if they're not available until 3 p.m., how could they do that when bidding into the day-ahead market, which closes at 10 o'clock?
If we set up the process for them to be submitted, a lot of the reservations we've been talking about, and like firming up what's been contracted and setting up the transmission is all stuff that's done prior to the day ahead time frame. And so these are feasible submissions. We just have to set up the ability for the ETAGs to be submitted in that window.
Okay. All right. So folks, it's 2:48. I'm going to go ahead and say that we've converged on a solution on this one, that at least the contractual commitment would depend on state requirements. I'll see how that flows into the rest of the questions that I had in this area. And then I will move on to the rest of these topics later on. So what we haven't talked about is whether the full resource or a partial resource opt-in can be used. Jeff mentioned that it might work in the approach here, but I want to make sure that it sort of makes sense here. This would address the length of commitment needed. I do think we need to think through the disqualifying criteria and who would notify us that they're no longer eligible to use it. But let's continue to think through these ideas. I'm going to go over very briefly the remaining questions that I want to tackle in Thursday's meeting. So there's a question here about path to supply, and it's brought up that surplus non-emitting supply might work here. So what do we mean by surplus non-emitting supply? And there's some questions around that. This document, by the way, is posted on the ISO's working group website. So let's continue to chew these over. But if you have time to review it before we have our Thursday working group, please take a look. And then just a sneak peek of what we'll talk about on Thursday. We're talking about the hurdle rate. So this is the rate that has to be overcome in order for the greenhouse gas zone to serve the non-greenhouse gas zone to serve the greenhouse gas zone. We want to talk a little bit about what the emissions rate that we're using here is. It was presumed that it would be 428, but Washington's is 437. So which makes more sense? Washington's will be 437 when they implement the program in January 2023. The next question will be the allowance price that's used in here, because this hurdle rate has a two-part calculation, or two component calculation. So there's going to be two allowance prices at the inception of Washington's greenhouse gas program. So how do we deal with the fact that there's two allowances, because the programs will be linked at their onset? Next was the idea of a dynamic, or maybe more accurate to describe it as time variable hurdle rate, one that changes throughout the day depending on the emissions intensity of the grid at a particular moment. So how that calculation goes is an open question. Moving on to compliance and reporting, we touched a little bit on this earlier today. And there's questions about basically how compliance and reporting works in the source specific, which might be easier to address based on today's conversation. Next would be how compliance and reporting works in the not using the resource, the source specific pathway, and who bears that responsibility. Is it the reporting entity? Is it, or do we split it between reporting and compliance? And then, regardless, is it borne by all the EDAM entities, or only those who are net exporters, EDAM load serving entities, et cetera? I think some of these questions were addressed in the scope document, but I would like to have that conversation. And then how it works in the context of multiple greenhouse gas zones, whether this change would require changes to CARB and Washington Department of Ecology's programs, and if so, what are the timelines associated with that? And then settlement of the greenhouse gas hurdle revenue, and how does that work, and how do we make sure that whoever bears the compliance obligation is made whole? So let me just put a pause there and turn it over to Brian Jacobson to do a brief recap of today's conversation, and then we'll turn it over to the schedule so we can take a look at that. So Brian, do you want to hop in and give us a little brief recap?
Sure, Kevin. Thank you. So we covered three topics tonight, this afternoon. First one, putting closure to a couple items that we didn't able to finish last week on the elements of some questions regarding the two approaches. So we gave the opportunity to finish those conversations. The one was regarding the concern on the premature, if you will, taking either of the two options off the table. And again, reiterating the request for an analysis and a compare between the resource-specific and the unspecified approach. In response, CalISO thought that that certainly that's a good idea, or offered that our support for that idea, and that we need to get it to a sufficient level of detail in order to conduct that analysis. But once we achieve that level of detail, then that analysis would be very helpful for comparing these approaches. The second item that we wanted to get closure on was to get the challenge of getting to an understanding of the unspecified approach and getting a sufficient level of detail, and making sure that understanding the process and decision making for the ultimate straw proposal to keep these options on the table for evaluation purposes. Then we moved on to the second item, and that is completing the review of the resource-specific design objectives with the proposed evaluation criteria, the discussion around the adequacy of the criteria to make a determination, or at least an initial polling of where the group thinks that the current level of understanding of these areas of the design objectives, that the current understanding of the unspecified approach meets or does not meet the objective. So we covered the remaining two items, number 6 and 7. The first one, seeking a simple solution, and that did get a medium to low polling response. One of the items discussed there was the concern for the accuracy of the baseline and the appropriateness of the deeming methodology. On the item number 7, the durability of the market design, very good conversation there, focused around as the market footprint approaches 80%, 100% of greenhouse gas zone definitions, then how do the various constructs that we've been talking about hold up under that scenario? So that was a lot of good conversation there, some very good concerns expressed. And there, again, the polling was pretty split, leaning a little bit towards maybe on the lower side of compliance with that design objective as well. And then finally, revisiting the unspecified approach, Kevin proposed his 4 groupings of outstanding topics to be discussed, and then proposed to the group that we get agreement or feedback on whether it is worthwhile to spend a substantial amount of our time in these working groups, perhaps 3 hours over the next couple of meetings, to do a deeper dive on these topics. And in general, that got a positive response. So we did start to dive into that, into the first item, which was source-specific pathway. There was 2 proposals, 2 approaches proposed. The something similar to the resource-specific approach of having a greenhouse gas bid adder that would be based on the emissions rate and not necessarily on the willingness to participate. And then the other proposal put on the table was a pre-submittal, not self-schedule, but a commitment of a resources a demonstration of availability to serve in the greenhouse gas zone. Then the final discussion was on the nature of the contractual commitment, and there we did get fairly good alignment that this would be defined primarily by the state policies. And that's all I have, Kevin. Back to you. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, Brian. I agree with all that. Sounds really good. Folks, we got 2 minutes left. I just wanted to talk about the next couple of meetings. So as I mentioned, I want to spend March 10th, so Thursday's meeting, talking about the remaining issues in that document that we just were discussing. On March 15th, we're excited to have WPTF give a presentation on a potential new methodology for the baseline for the greenhouse gas attribution. So I believe that instead of using as is proposed in the extended day ahead market resource specific approach, where the ISO policy team considered using the RSE optimization results as that baseline, WPTF thinks they might have a way to isolate that incremental dispatch above the base schedule, so to speak. So we're excited to see that and have a robust discussion around that new methodology. So WPTF will be spending the first hour or so of March 15th meeting to do that. And then I'd like to, if we get through all of the unspecified or zonal approach questions, do an evaluation of the approach in the second half of that meeting. So that would be next Tuesday. And then we'd have that final meeting for any cleanup or remaining topics and anything about the working group report. So thanks everybody for joining today. And I thought it was a really good conversation and looking forward to another good one on Tuesday. So thanks everybody.